Thank you all for coming. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Emily Holland. I'm the managing editor of Poet Lore at the Writers Center. And the Writers Center is the host of this event. So we are a literary arts nonprofit. We do dozens of free events like this one throughout the year in various formats like online. And we also do about 300 different workshops a year too, all writing levels. I'll also post some information on our new summer season coming up. We have some workshops that are starting at $25 a piece, different lengths, different genres, all kinds of stuff for you to get your hands on and keep writing during this time. So I want to get started by just reading a little bit about our guest tonight, Elizabeth Lindsay Rogers. I'm sure those of you who are familiar with her are as excited as I am for this conversation. And I've had the pleasure of interviewing you before, Elizabeth, so this is a nice kind of part two for that, and maybe to get a little bit deeper into the poems here. But first I'll just read the bio real quick. So Elizabeth Lindsay Rogers is the author of Chord Box from University of Arkansas Press, a finalist for both the Miller Williams Prize and the Lambda Literary Award, and the Tote Torn Away from the Seasons from Acre Books, which came out this year. And let me skip around a little bit. Born and raised in North Carolina, me too. Rogers was educated in the public schools and trained as both a dancer and a musician, which I'm sure we'll be talking about today. She received her BA from Oberlin College in creative writing and dance, and an MFA in poetry from Cornell. You are also a 2-year fellowship recipient with the Kenyon Review, and you are a contributing editor at the Kenyon Review as well. So that's all exciting. Hopefully we can have some time to talk about all those things and how they impact your writing with this book. Like I said earlier, as people were trickling in, we will have time for questions at the end. So if you're using the chat function on Zoom, just put a big Q in front of your question and I'll be able to scroll through and loop those in towards the end of the conversation. So Elizabeth, thank you for being with us.
I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, this is, a little bit different type of event, but I'm really excited just to dive into not only the new book, but just talk a little bit about your process overall, crafting between book 1 and book 2, and how all of your various trainings in the arts kind of seep into your work. So I guess, there's so much that we can just talk about with the newest book. To say it's timely, I think is a little bit of an understatement, right? It's so steeped in this sense of isolation and disruption and, all those themes that we'll talk about. But I wanted to start a little bit on a broader level and talk about your drafting process and thinking about when you're first entering into a poem, what are the qualities that you look for in those stages of editing, revision, publication? What draws you, or what are you drawn to the most in the poetry that you write as you go through?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think it's different for every poem, but as I think back over my process, I would say that 2 things, form and sound, are 2 things that really draw me, like in the early drafts. They're like kind of what drive the process. Mm-hmm. I was thinking about how, some of my drafting process, in the early stages is really about kind of trying to turn my logical brain off and following basically what I think sounds good. I know that's kind of a really generalized way of talking about it, but it's in the later stages, right, that I start to go back and I say, like, does this actually make sense, on some level? I think the first draft is very much sort of like a big tone poem, right? And then, I don't know, for this book in particular, I also had to think about what is it like to live on a completely different planet? Like, what are the qualities? Like, what what aspects of your life would be completely altered and what things would remain the same. So that requires like a deep sense of an imagination. So that process is a little bit different, because, you know, I had to kind of set up the rules for this particular world that I was working within. That's something I don't find myself doing in poetry that much, but, you know, once I started that sequence of poems that eventually became the book, I had to make sure, right, that there was some consistency, right, in the logic between the poems. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely got the emphasis on sound in both of your books. I mean, Chord Box, when you think of the name Chord Box, you're immediately drawn to voice and music, and a lot of those poems themselves have to deal with music. And even in your newest book, you do a lot with voice. Each section is kind of constructed as a chorus of voices and speakers. So could you just talk a little bit about how you translate that musical inclination into your work, and how you kind of pursue that, even if it's not the subject matter of the work itself?
Right. Well, so I'll backtrack a little bit. So my first book, Chord Box, right, was about two different things. It was about the process of becoming a musician as a teenager and studying music. And so obviously the subject of music is coming up a lot, and, you know, within the poems, there's a lot of attention to sound. And then the second half of the book is about the years that I lived in rural China. And of course, Mandarin is a tonal language, right? So there's a connection, a sort of distal connection between those two subject matters. And in this book, I actually kind of co-opted a lot of musical forms and made them into poems. Like, you'll see poems that are, you know, pose themselves as duets, or, you know, it poses itself as a fugue, and that kind of thing. With my newest book, I think the relationship was a little bit more oblique. But one thing I was thinking about when I was writing the poems is that sound on Mars, right, and an atmosphere that has less oxygen, is going to not carry as far, and things sound sort of atonal and weird, right, in that atmosphere, or supposedly they do. And so some of the strangeness of the poems is like derived from thinking about that. Again, that's like kind of it's a very oblique connection. I did use a couple of musical forms again in this book. For example, there's a sequence of sonnets towards the end of the book that also poses itself as a fugue, right? And there are two voices that kind of like follow one another. Mm-hmm. So that's something that like kind of carried over from my first book. I guess because I trained as a musician first, right, before I was really a poet. I'm always thinking about those kind of inherited musical forms and like how I could translate them into language. Yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great. I think that's very apparent. I mean, I've been thinking about that fugue form itself in the newest book for probably since we last spoke, which was now maybe a few months ago, mm-hmm. Because of the way that it incorporates not just the musical quality of the form, but also even the fabric of the poem itself has that rhythm and has that overlapping sensation. And then when you see it on the page, you get that as well too.
Yeah, somebody was asking me, they're like, well, how would you read this poem? And I was like, well, you could read it different ways. Like, one way is to have, you know, one voice start, you know, at a certain place, and then the second voice kind of picks up and they sort of interrupt each other. That's kind of how I would think of it. But in a fugue, right, there's always tension, right? So there are moments where there's actually like a clash or a contrapuntal quality going on. And so like, I'm always asking myself, like, how can I translate that into language? And I do the best I can. I don't think I'm really successful at it, to be honest, but I keep trying.
Sometimes that's all we can do. That's the writing that turns into the book, right?
Yeah.
So I want to talk a little bit too about how you create landscape in your work, which is something that I saw in Chord Box as well, a lot of the poems are really founded in a specific location, especially the second portion where it's talking about China. And then, of course, with the Tilt Torn Away from the Seasons, it's really all about that foreign landscape, that foreignness of something that's unexplored, something that's unknown. Mars, you get a lot of that nitty gritty dirt talk, dusty, and it just is so evocative of something that's familiar, but something that's also not familiar. So I wonder how you go about constructing those senses of place within the poems without even knowing what that place might look like.
Yeah. Well, in some ways, not knowing what it's like gives you a sort of permission. But I didn't want to just make everything up, right? So, of course, I followed, or when it first started, especially, I followed the Mars rovers like mission pretty religiously, right? Like all the images that were coming back, I would look at, and spend a lot of time thinking about them. I've spent most of my life living in places that get like a lot of rain. So I really, when I was thinking about the landscape of Mars and what it would look like if people were eventually going to live there, I had to do some research like on desert plants, right? The types of things that are likely to survive, and also kind of remind myself how ecosystems get started. We learn all that stuff when we're kids, like in school, but I had forgotten a lot of like ecological succession and like how it gets started. So for the poems about Mars, I did have to do some research to kind of imagine in a way that would be plausible. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And then, for poems about real places, for example, I lived in rural China for a few years. Trying to evoke a sense of that place is a really challenging thing because it's a real place, right? But it's a place that I, cannot claim as a place of origin. So it's tricky. The best I can do is to try to kind of capture the particulars, right, for a sense of authenticity, if that makes sense. Like, there's this street in Beijing that I used to walk down all the time where there are people bringing their pet birds out in cages and hanging them in the trees. Like, that's kind of strange. Like, okay, like maybe I'll include that detail. Or, just conversations that I had like with vendors in the marketplace in the small town where I lived. Things my students said to me. I try to like encapsulate all of that when I'm describing what a place is like. But again, it's a very tricky and risky thing to do, right? And I was aware of that risk when I was writing. I was like, this is a place that I live, right? And where I am not just a tourist or a traveler, right? I'm spending, part of my life here, but I'm also, I can't claim this place. So it's kind of a delicate dance. I have to think about all the choices I make pretty carefully.
Right. Yeah, for sure. And that makes it all the more powerful when you include those personal details that add the experience to the place. It's not just the place, but your experience of it through the poems.
I think I was really lucky in particular where I ended up in China because, most people, like when if they're not Chinese, they think of China, they're thinking of the cities. And I actually lived in a town of about 40,000 people, which for China is like a village. And it's a part of China that tourists don't visit, right? It's a coal mining province, not glamorous. I mean, it's real life. So I think in some ways it was cool that that's where I ended up because I had such a different experience than a lot of people do if they're outsiders who come to China.
Yeah. And talking about landscape as part of the poems, I'm also thinking about the landscape of the page in the book, right? And how you construct the different forms of the poem visually on the page. Let me pull one up here. Something like this that were very spread out.
Mhm.
If you have the book on page 14, this is one of the backflash poems, but then also there's the ones like Astro Gleam on page 21 that start on the right and then trickle down.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
the poem moves this way.
Right. So can you talk a little bit about how that almost visual landscape on the page is working with the poems? It feels to me very much like a perfect example of form matching the content, where you get a visual indication of that.
Yeah. So I did some experimentation with the field of the page in my first book. And you always see that moment in your earlier work where you see yourself edging towards the thing you're going to do next, right? But you're not quite there yet. Um, for me, the landscape of Mars, looking at it, at least the images that we have of it, it's so bizarre, that I thought to myself, there has to be a way um, to physically encapsulate this experience on the page. Like, I needed another level of meaning in the poems. It didn't feel right to sort of tack them all against the left margin, because that was convention. So there's one form that you mentioned, which is, there's a number of poems where the poem starts in the right margin and it moves progressively left, right, and then it goes back. It's like kind of in loose tercets, like 3 lines kind of progressively moving across the page from right to left. And for me, that was a way of kind of encapsulating first, like the panorama of the landscape, the sort of open terrain, okay, with nothing on it. So you use the full field of the page. And then also it's a little bit disorienting to read. You still read, obviously, from left to right, right, as you're reading the lines, but you're also moving from right to left at the same time. And there's something a little bit disorienting about that I think, like on a somatic level, kind of feels unmooring in the same way that maybe you would if you were in a different kind of atmosphere on a different planet. So I was really intentional in my use of that form. It's not just decorative. It does look really cool, I think, on the page, but it's not. Yeah. It's not just there as an ornament, right? It's meant to kind of physically give the reader a way of experiencing this place, like on another level. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think that's part of the struggle too with any type of form, be it a visual form or a poetic form. It's that the fear is getting trapped in the form without there being a reason for the form to be there.
Yeah. I should probably mention, in my experimentation of on the page, I studied with Alice Fulton when I was in graduate school, and she, to my knowledge, was like really. She may have been the very first. I think she was one of the very first contemporary poets to use the right margin exclusively. Right. And we see that all the time now, right? But she was actually, to my knowledge, like, the person who kind of made that possible. And she was very intentional about her reasons for doing it. It had to do with, spaces that are traditionally inhabited by women and not seen by the public. And it was really about paying, sort of credence to people who were marginalized. Right. She has a lot of essays where she talks about this, but I definitely would cite her as an influence. Even if I wasn't writing that way at the time that I was studying with her at Cornell, it came back in my work at a later time.
Yeah. And talking about form, I think you brought this up earlier about the sonnet sequences and the various crowns that you featured in the book. Could you talk a little bit about how you worked to, one, utilize that form in different ways and kind of keep it fresh, and two, what it was like just generating that form and using it throughout the book?
Sure. Yeah, so to some extent, using the sonnet crown, in the beginning, it was really just a way of getting myself writing more than 14 lines, right? I would get to the end of the first 14 lines and I would think, okay, I can like keep going, right? I'm gonna recycle that last line. It's very useful form for that, right? Because you already have the beginning of the poem, which is often where I have so much anxiety that I just can't proceed and then I don't write. So in the beginning, it was really just kind of an exercise that I was giving myself in how can I, give myself a form and give myself kind of a launch pad right into the poem, which is, whatever the previous line was from the sonnet. I had always been interested in sonnets. I'd always loved sonnets, but I had never really written any successfully. For me, my poems are, I don't know, I'm kind of a control freak, and something about the sonnet was it was too much control for me, right? Like the rhyme scheme, it became this kind of like imprisoned little space. Normally it doesn't work for me, but something about giving up the rhyme scheme, right? And for the most part, giving up iambic pentameter. The sonnets have a kind of rhythm to them, but it's very loose. Relaxing the form a little bit, a smash sonnet, as some people sometimes call it, was the right balance for me, right balance between like structure and freedom. And then I tried to use it in the book in places, again, where content could mirror form. Like the first sonnet sequence in the book is about the experience of being in deep space. And I thought, like, what is more like, deep space than a big loopy, form where things keep coming back and circling back and getting repeated. And so, I don't know, it became kind of an exercise in how form and content mirror each other. And then I don't know, once I did it once, I kind of got addicted and started doing it. I definitely have some sonnet sequences that have not, made it off my hard drive. They're not all successful.
Right. Yeah.
But I do find that it's a good way to get yourself writing, and it's a good way of pushing yourself towards a longer poem. A lot of poems in this collection are actually quite long. So.
Was that new for you for this collection? I mean, I'm thinking to Chord Box, there were a few longer ones, but yeah, it does seem like they were pretty much poems.
You see the long poems in Chord Box in the last section, which actually chronologically is later work. So I was edging towards it. No, I've always been interested in long poems. I am super verbose, can never get it in the tight little box it's supposed to be. I know that's funny for a poet, right? But I always have more to say than I can contain on one page. I'm actually trying now to write shorter poems because I think they allow for different opportunities and different challenges, and they require a different kind of skill.
Yeah, I think too, when I'm thinking about the newest book, it's so centralized in its content that it almost feels like one long poem itself, where everything is its own section and working in its own way, but it has this unity to it. And I wonder if you could talk about using the second book as a way to maybe look more at one idea, one kind of narrative aspect, versus the first book, which was it had a lot of connectivity to it, but it also had a lot of differences between the sections.
Yeah, they're really different books in that way. And even though there's some content and theme overlap, I think the process of kind of building the body of the book was like completely different. So that was a two-part question. First was about the so will you say that again? The structure?
Yeah. I'm just thinking about books 1 and 2 and how 2 feels very much like a centralized narrative concept, and just how that came about for you.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So the first poem in the Torn Away from the Seasons was actually The Frontier, which is the first poem in the book. It's really unusual when that happens. But that's like kind of the pole poem that kind of teaches you how to read the collection. And if you haven't read the book, which I assume most of you haven't, it's a poem about the experience of looking at the first panoramic photographs of Mars, right? And it kind of posits the surface of Mars as being akin to the American West while it was in the process of being colonized. And that's like kind of the big metaphor for the book. After I wrote that poem, I thought, this is interesting. Never done anything like this before. And then more poems in this bizarre Mars world just like kept coming. And I like kept getting deeper and deeper in my imagining. And I'm like, oh, now there are people living there. Like this person is talking, this person is talking, and I kind of was in denial for a long time about it becoming a book. The first draft of The Tilt Torn Away from the Seasons actually had more poems that were about ecological destruction and ecological issues on our planet, right? And I thought it's going to be a more varied book where, some of the poems are kind of projected into the future, and some are very much grounded in, where we are now. And, I don't know, I kind of liked that structure, but in the end, I think it was maybe, it was too much. Right. And the poems about Mars always won out. They were just so much more bizarre and interesting. So it had an unequal balance, I think. So my point in telling you this is I tried to make this book more like my first one, but it didn't really work. And in the end, most of the poems end up being set on Mars, and you get these kind of Earth-based poems that are little brief flashbacks, right, all throughout the book, which is how I dealt with those other poems. But I had to cut most of the other poems because it didn't work. Another thing that occurs to me is that The Tilt Torn Away from the Seasons was also written in a shorter amount of time, whereas my first book, most of it was from graduate school, but there were also poems in the first book that came from much earlier. Whereas my new book is maybe mostly written in the period of like 3 years, which for me is like a really short period of time. I'm kind of a slow writer. So I don't know, that could explain the difference. Simply that the first book was more assorted because the poems were coming from a longer stretch of time. Mm-hmm. But again, I also tried to make the second book more varied. And in the end, I think, these poems about Mars they had too much pull, right? And so I needed to kind of let them be the focus of the book.
Yeah. They didn't want to let other things kind of come into that space, for sure.
I mean, I really liked that other version of the manuscript, and I had a couple of people read it who liked it, but then, I think for a lot of people, it was really just too much. Mm. And I always, whenever I have an early draft of a poetry book, it's always way longer than it should be. I'm one of those people who has the giant stone, right? Who has to chisel down the stone into the shape rather than piling the stones on, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Great metaphor for the process.
Again, I told you I was verbose. Yeah. My first book is really long too. For a poetry book, it's almost 100 pages, which you don't see that very often.
Well, it's 100 pages of really great poems, so I hope that everyone listening goes out and buys not only the new one, but the first one as well. We're talking about metaphors, and Mars in The Tilt Torn Away from the Seasons is like a giant metaphor for all of these different things: colonialism, the patriarchy, environmental destruction. Can you talk about how that expanded metaphor enabled you to tackle all these different large ideas in the poems, and how those ideas kind of bubbled up through the surface almost?
Yeah. So like I said, when I wrote the first poem for the book, which, compares the landscape of Mars to the American West, the colonial stuff comes to the surface immediately. I kept thinking about how the landscape looked like even like a Western set, right?
Mhm.
So like also like representations of the West was something that I was thinking about. Um, but then, you know, I had to also think about what would compel humans to like put this much investment in another planet. And um, just thinking about our world circumstances, climate change is really the thing. You know, it's a thing I've been interested in writing about for a long time. But it also seems like it was a natural sort of cause, right, narratively in the book for why people were going somewhere else. There's also a weird way in which, you know, this really bleak landscape of Mars like reminds me of what the planet is becoming,
Mhm.
right? As climate gets more and more extreme, and as you know, destruction speeds up and the species die out. And so um, at a certain point, I realized that it was going to be kind of a slippery metaphor, right? You know, I mean, the big conceit, right, is that like the American West is the surface of Mars, or Mars is the American West. Like that's the big conceit. But also, it's more slippery than that, right?
Mhm.
Like sometimes Mars is what our planet is like after we destroyed it, but sometimes it's where we go when we have destroyed our planet. And sometimes it's a place where all the patriarchal mistakes, right, get replayed. And sometimes it is a respite from that. Not usually, but the metaphor is a little bit slippery and is complicated. I don't think it's for every reader. There were definitely people who read, you know, the book before it was a book that wanted more clear answers about everything, right? They
Mm.
wanted to know why people were there, what happened to them, what does it mean? And it's just, I don't know, it's not that kind of book. The sort of the resonance is muddled, you know,
Mhm.
places, and it could be um, it has multiple meanings, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I can. I'm almost imagining those readers who wanted more clarity to be a little frustrated with perhaps like the exit interview poem
Right, right.
or the
Like,
intro
what happens
poem.
to these
Yeah,
people? Like, we don't know.
these
Um,
aren't
all, all,
answers.
all we know is that basically the colonial experiment is like kind of a semi-failure. But what does that mean?
Mm.
Right? Does it mean everybody leaves? Does it mean that, you know, everyone dies out? Does it mean that it becomes the United States of America? I mean, there's there's multiple possibilities for that failure.
Mm.
But yeah, there were definitely, you know, one press I can think of in particular, like wanted it to be more of a novel in verse, right? Where,
Mm.
you know, a central character at the end, something happens to them. I was like, that's not this book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll probably ask maybe one or two more questions, and then we have a few kind of coming in through the chat that I've been keeping track of as well. So I think something that I always am interested in is how we as writers are always wearing many hats. And I know that you also work as a contributing editor for the Kenyon Review. So I wonder if you could talk about how that experience influences your writing process or even your submitting process, if it does or doesn't, or just what has been the impact for you kind of working behind the scenes with a literary journal.
Sure. So I started at the Kenyon Review in 2012, I believe, when I went there as the fellow, right? And for those 2 years, 2012, 2014, I read um, a lot for the magazine, right? And was super involved. And now my role at the magazine's a little bit more distant, but I'm still reading for them. And I've also helped to judge some contests that they have run. Um, Oh, I mean, anybody who reads for a magazine probably has this experience, but it's just so interesting to see what kind of work people are doing,
Mm-hmm.
and how much of it is good. You know, the Kenyon Review gets thousands and thousands of submissions every year. It's more, and you know, we turn most good stuff away in the end. I mean, there are a lot of spaces for work and maybe more spaces at Kenyon Review than some of their magazines because there's the online component and the print journal and you know, the staff there has really made an effort to like expand, how much work they can feature. But most of the good work you still turn away, right?
Mhm.
Because there's just not room for it. Or, I may pass something up that I think is great. And in the end, some editor, higher up may have to turn it down just because there's not enough space. So I don't know, that's heartening, right? To see how much work is good. But there's also a lot of work that I feel like is really competent, right? But not inspired. Like it doesn't give me chills, or it doesn't make me wish I had written it, but there's nothing like wrong with it. Right. So for me, that's like a big challenge, because, I look a lot of the work I've done and I'm like, is this inspired or is it competent? And I think most of us, I mean, I don't know. I guess I'll just speak for myself. Most of my work is not amazing, right? It's competent. And this really pushes me to invest myself in the work that I think is really inspired, right? And to really pour my energy into that. So I guess in some ways it makes me a more discerning critic of my own work. But also to recognize that, poets that are really amazing also don't, hit the same mark every single time. And we shouldn't expect every piece that we produce to be as amazing as the last one, or, our best work. And I would say like at least half of the work that I do, like never makes it off my hard drive, right? And it doesn't go anywhere because it's just, it's not my best work. So I don't know. I can't decide whether that's heartening or discouraging, but you see that in the process of reading submissions. I mean, we've all sent out poems, right, that are not our best work. It's sometimes sending out as a way of kind of testing the waters too, to see how a wider audience is gonna approach something that you've written.
Yeah, that's great. It's just making me think of all of my Google Docs that I have that are poems that will probably never see the light of day. And that's how we get to that great work, that inspired work. So it's all there for a reason.
And of course, it's all very subjective. I mean, that's the other thing. Like you try, like if you teach, for example, you try to like instill this idea in your students, like, no, it's not all just like one person's opinion. Like there are things that, make work vibrant. But in the end, I mean, there's such a huge subjective, there's such a huge subjectivity to the experience of evaluating what's good and not good, which I hope makes a more democratic space, right, for people's work.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so I have a few questions from the chat that I've pulled out. First one, it says, you mentioned sound is important at the beginning of writing. Is reading or performance important to you? Do you think about an audience? And does the experience of reading ever lead to revision?
Yes. I'm answering the last question and working backwards. The experience of reading definitely leads to revision. If something doesn't sound right out loud, or it feels awkward, then I know that I need to revisit that. And I do read my work aloud as I'm drafting it as well. Sometimes I record myself on the computer or my phone. Sometimes I just, talk to myself in a room. But definitely reading aloud is a central part of the process. And, so I would say that it both drives the early work, but also shapes revision to a huge extent. And I think it's probably maybe the last revision that I would do, right? Is like what still doesn't sound right, what still feels like, that it hasn't quite, all the screws haven't been tightened.
Great. So the next question, regarding appearance on the page, do you use line breaks to create a particular look?
Yeah, I do. There's always, like, when you're using, say, the full field of the page, there's always this kind of tension between how long do I want this line to be, to kind of fit the visual purposes, but then also, line breaks are points of tension in a poem, and they're places where you can create multiple meanings. And so I have to think about where to break the lines for that purpose too. So it's a little bit in push and pull. My lines tend to be like fairly uniform in length, but I'm always interested in breaking the line in a place that I think adds another layer of meaning to the poem.
Great. Yeah. I think those line breaks, even in the almost stair-stepping poems, we see that create its own type of tension for sure throughout the page. And then, of course, the visual aspect of it too.
It was really challenging to do copy edits for this book. The last couple of passes were just totally maddening, because there is a uniformity to how the lines are broken in the spacing, but there's also a little bit of push and pull. It's not 100% uniform. So it's like, well, this feels right, so let's do it like this. But that was very hard.
Yeah.
In the last couple of passes, my editor was very patient.
So I just got a follow-up that you kind of touched upon right then, but it says, in general, is there an instinct or advice on when a line break just feels right? Does it naturally emerge, or are there things to watch for in terms of how the load of a line feels?
Well, I think that's different for every poet, and every poet has like a different kind of working philosophy of how the line functions. For me, I like a line to provide tension, and so you'll see me breaking the line, mid-clause. I'll use a lot of enjambment, places where you get to the end of the line and you think it has one meaning, and then you go to the next line and there's another. So you get the suggestion of the first meaning and then the clarification of the second. So it puts both ideas into your head at once. I'm really interested in ambiguity. But there are also just times when you need the end of the line to be a place of clarity too. So it's kind of, you have to kind of balance, or I have to balance those two impulses. I'm also trying to push myself at different times to use the line in different ways. My first book, all the lines were like super, super short. They were these tight little poems. And then in this book, I really wanted to get out of that. I felt like I had, pushed that as far as it could go. And so I started getting interested in longer lines in the second book.
Great. Oh, this is a good question. Do you think you'll use the poems that didn't make the cut for your book in a future work?
That's an interesting question. Well, okay, so there are definitely some poems about Mars, right, that I wrote that didn't make it into the book. And those, I don't think that they were ever going to. Some of them were actually published, right? They were published, like with poems that you currently see in the book. But I couldn't find a home for them in building this, body of the book. And then I assume this question is directed towards when I said I, had to cut a lot of those other poems out. I don't know the answer to that. They may have lived their life already, or they may, I don't know. I guess they could come back into new work. Once, I've passed the point with a project like this book, it's really hard for me to go back to that work and figure out how to give it new life. But I don't know. This person has given me an idea. This is Liza who asked this question. Yeah. Yeah, maybe this is something I need to explore.
And then one more, was the process of cutting poems in the book something you worked on with the editor, or did they get involved in that process, or was this kind of before submission?
Yeah. So for the Till Torn Away from the Seasons, the form that it is currently in, that it got published in, is basically the one that I sent it to the editor in. But the backstory there is that this book was actually under contract with a different publisher a couple of years ago. And it's a long story, but I ended up having to pull the book from that publisher. It's one of those nightmare things that you hope never happens to you. It happened to me. And in between, right, that contract, when the book was under contract, and then current publisher, I did revise the book again. I felt like I couldn't send it out again. It was like this dead animal that I was dragging around. I was like, remember this? Like, do you want to see it? And in that process, I did cut some poems, right, from the version of the book that had been under contract, right? So I revised it again. By the time it got to Acre, it was pretty much in its current form. My editor kind of saw it as, a complete thing as it was. We didn't really do that. With my first book, we did cut poems in the editorial process. Enid Shomer, who was the series editor at that time, is notorious for having these like 3-hour phone calls where she like quizzes you on every single choice that you've made in every poem. I was in my 20s and didn't really know that much yet about publishing, and I was just like terrified of that process. We did end up cutting some poems. I remember this one poem where she was like, how everyone always looks for the weakest poem in the book? She's like, this is that poem. I was like, I don't read that way. Like, what are you talking about? But I didn't do it with the second book, but I definitely did it with Chord Box, which is already a long book in this form, and it was even longer in the original.
Well, that's great. I have a private question asking how everyone can get their hands on your book. So I'm going to go ahead and paste in some information to the general chat with your Twitter handle, where to get the books. That's the link to Old Town Books. But again, local bookstores, if you're familiar with, I think it's called Bookshop. They're an online bookseller that most of the proceeds go back to the local bookstore. So I would also look for it there. The Writer Center website is down there too, if you're interested in workshops. And then we have 2 donation links. We're taking donations for our scholarship program. So if you like these free events and you have some money laying around, which is hard to come by these days, but we're very appreciative for everyone being here and Elizabeth for sharing your wisdom with us. Maybe I'll close out with one question about book recommendations. So do you have any books on craft that you find yourself returning to, or maybe essays or articles or someone's work that you find yourself returning to learn more about the process for yourself?
Well, since we've been talking a lot about the line and uses of the line, various theories, I'll recommend, I can type it in the chat. So it's Emily Roscoe and Anton van der Zee are the editors, and it's called A Broken Thing, Poets on the Line. I'm gonna write that right now. Basically, this is a book of short craft essays by poets about either how they use the line or how they see the line in other people's work. And they're all they're like micro essays. And it's just really fun to see the different approaches, and you can, read a whole bunch of them, together, and keep coming back to it because it's so short. And I recommend this book to, say, like my students at the advanced level when they're like trying to figure out, how do you what their sense of form is in their poems. So since we've been talking so much about the line, I would recommend that book. And I'll write down the editors in the chat, Anton.
Great. Thank you so much. Are you working on any new projects that we can be on the lookout for, or taking some time to digest this one?
Yeah, I definitely am in a slower period right now than maybe I have been in the past, but I have 2 poetry projects going that I think are going to be 2 separate books. And one of them is a series of like long site-specific poems about climate change, right? So that sort of, it dovetails off this. I mean, they're not set on Mars. And then I have another project that are, it's like poems, more personal lyrics about the experience of queer parenting, right, and fertility, because I have a son now. I also have an essay collection that I'm looking for a home for, if you know
Yay.
anybody.
Any editors in the audience? Raise your hands.
It's a lot of administrative work these days, like kind of
Yeah.
dragging around a manuscript and trying to figure out what to do with it. But
Right.
anyway, all
Well,
right.
best of luck. Thank you so much for your time and for all of your responses. Really appreciate chatting with you today.
Thank you so much. It's great talking. Thank you everyone for being here. And hope to see you in the future.
Yeah.
Yeah, and please buy the book if you can.
Please buy the book.
It was the warehouse was closed for a little bit, but it's back open now. It's the University of Chicago distribution, so you can get it from their website directly too.
Great. All right. Well, good night, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Again, we have all kinds of free events going on via Zoom now. So sign up for our newsletter and just get in the know for all of those. Our workshops are coming up and should be enough things to keep us all busy. So thank you for being here and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Have a good one.
Thank you.
Bye.